So, welcome to 13 Minutes Why Every Man Needs a Why. I am here in the virtual studio with my now new friend, Boomer Anderson. Welcome, Boomer.
It's so good to be here with you, and I wish I was with you in person, but we'll make the most of this and have a great conversation.
And when you come to Boulder, I'll meet you there and we'll do another one.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, you probably have a just as hard a name as I do at Starbucks, as we were talking about, probably for different reasons. But we
Some days it's bummer. Other days it's some mixture of letters that I don't quite understand how they associate with boomer, but depends, I guess, on how much I'm smiling that
brother, you're going to get no sympathy from me with a name like Baruch. So,
day.
so I win on that front. But I want to jump into really the nature of our conversation and give people a little bit of background about you. For those newly tuning in and to kind of give you some context, Boomer, it's called 13 Minutes Why Every Man Needs a Why, based on a statistic that most people don't know. So if you didn't know this, you're not the only one. Every 13 minutes in America, a man chooses to die by suicide, and it is a silent epidemic. I hear story after story of people whose friends, fathers, brothers, uncles, and 80% of suicides, by the way, are men. So it's disproportionately male and it's underwhelmingly spoken about. And so I've just committed my life to shining a light into this, not simply for those who are at the end of their life, the end of their rope, but for the men who are far before that. And, I want to get upstream from this. I want to get to the place where the man never even gets to that point of desperation. And I believe that happens when we discover and live our meaning, our purpose, or as my teacher and mentor, Viktor Frankl, calls it, our why. And so that's what you're doing here because a friend of ours said, you got to talk to Boomer. This is a guy who knows his why, who's living his why. So here we go, Boomer. Let's dig into your why.
Absolutely. And where do you want to start, my friend?
Well, I know you have a lot of CEO roles, and I know one of them is Smarter, Not Harder, SNH Life Sciences, and it's the technologies behind transcriptions. Is that how you
Yep.
say it? So I know you have many hats. That's one of them. Maybe that's a jumping off point.
Sure. Look, I actually I'll take a step back and say, like, how did I get into this health field? Because the funny thing about, if you kind of go through my entire CV, is that I didn't set out to go work in life sciences or health. I was actually in investment banking. And what you outlined first there, about 13 minutes, a man takes his life in the United States. A personal story here. I started my career in investment banking 2008, right after Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy. And in early 2009, one of my high school friends, he worked for Lehman Brothers, then became Barclays. He actually ended up taking his life after doing 3 consecutive all-nighters, trying to build a financial model for a transaction that in no way could have happened in 2009. And one of the reasons why I'm glad we're having this conversation is because people like Greg and also other entrepreneurs that go through the struggle with mental health are kind of the reason why I keep doing what I do, and also why I'm not afraid to open the kimono a lot about my own struggles there, right? And so Greg took his life because on that third day, he submitted his financial model and the person above him said, start over, right? And don't go to sleep tonight, get this to me tomorrow. If you don't sleep for 3 days, that's pretty uncontrollable from a mental health standpoint. And, took his life, and that was very unfortunate. But ended up in investment banking after 2 years moving to Singapore. Did everything I wanted to by the age of 30 in investment banking. And, I've got this continuous theme, this why behind what I do of challenging the process. And I kept looking around at the age of 30 in investment banking and seeing everybody that was doing my job at that point was 60 years old. And so I decided to leave and march out on my own path. In the process of leaving, I had to serve out a resignation period. And in that resignation period, of course, I had good insurance. So I went and got a series of tests from a doctor. Um, one of those tests was cardiac CT scan for calcium. So they look at the presence of calcium in your arteries, and they found what they found was is that I had calcium in my arteries. In fact, the doctor said, "Oh shit," when he saw it, because at that point, from the outside, I was like a picture perfect um, representation of health. Like I had sub 10% body fat. I was doing CrossFit 6 times a week. I was following whatever the diet of the day was, but it turns out, I had this calcium in my heart, which led me to be diagnosed with atherosclerosis or cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease was the very thing that I sat out my entire life to avoid because my grandfather, he died before I was the age of 5 of cardiovascular disease. He was morbidly obese, but he had a heart attack and a stroke and passed away. And so I'd then been doing everything possible to avoid this very thing. And all of a sudden, I got cardiovascular disease. So the question really then became is like, okay, what did I get wrong? Now, how does this tie into challenging the process? At that point, the medical system told me, and I have nothing against current healthcare. I think there's certain things that current healthcare does wrong. To call it healthcare, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. But the cardiologist that I was seeing wanted me to go on a statin and take that statin for the rest of my life and come see me again in 10 years. The problem with that for me is I didn't have high cholesterol. So I wasn't your kind of phenotypical normal expression of somebody who has cardiovascular disease. And so I voluntarily took myself off the statin and said, I'm going to figure this out. Right. And so that path led me to diving into the omics sciences. Things like genetics were becoming very popular in 2016. Eventually led me to start my own podcast. Interviewed a number of people, found a couple of doctors, Dr. Ted Achacoso and Dr. Scott Schur, who were working on a nonprofit that teaches doctors and healthcare practitioners how to optimize for health rather than treat disease. And it just really aligned with what I wanted to do, which was to place a health manager in our current healthcare system. So if you think about our current healthcare system, it's really only disease management. But if you're a person who struggles with brain fog, perhaps has, issues sleeping, or struggles with stress, where do you go? And so health optimization medicine practice is that vehicle. And we train about 100 to 150 practitioners a year right now in how to use that framework for the betterment of things like mental health and physical health.
Story behind the reason why they do what they do. I just think it's so important. Once you know that, you can really see a man's core values, and it doesn't feel like he's selling; it feels like he's telling. And that came through in the origin story of your business. Um, what type of reception are you getting out there with this approach?
Well, I mean, going back and to sort of the why of challenging the process, I think when you challenge any process, there's an initial resistance, right? And so you'll have a certain segment of the population, usually the early adopters, who will be like, okay, let me reason on first principles. Does this make sense? And so to that type of population, we're doing really well. And what's interesting about currently in the United States and elsewhere in the world is that people are becoming quite fed up with their healthcare system, right? In the
Yeah.
United States, we spend between $13,000 and $15,000 a year per person on healthcare, but the results are miserable, right? Healthcare bankruptcy is still one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States. So these are people who either don't have health insurance or their health insurance does not cover a procedure, and then they're forced to go into bankruptcy. You also have the fact that the average, actually greater than the average American, is overweight, and it's something like 50% of the United States is obese, right? And so the results, or going back to investment banking, the return on investment is negligible or negative, right? So there's this growing distaste with our current healthcare system. So whereas when we first launched this back in 2020, and this was based on like decades of clinical experience from Dr. Scott and Dr. Ted, um, when we first launched this back in 2020, practitioners like, oh, interesting. But now it's more like, let me hear more and I want to do that because there's a patient demand now. And it also couples with the fact that like doctor burnout, physician burnout is a huge thing too. And so you're looking at this confluence of events or this convergence of events, which is actually causing this movement to really have lift off and start going.
Um, I kind of reading a little bit about you and your journey, and I know you're just this entrepreneurial spirit. I can feel it in the way you talk. And I've never met an entrepreneur who has a straight trajectory, right? It's just not the nature of the beast. So to get here to this place where you're just, so clear-eyed, you're articulating it, it's coming from a place of core values. I don't imagine it was I don't imagine you're different than the other entrepreneurs I know. I imagine there were some bumps along the way. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so many. And I, I think a lot of entrepreneurship is sensationalized now and has a little bit of survivorship bias. So in if you pick up Inc. magazine, if you pick up Entrepreneur magazine, they're not necessarily going to talk to you about mental health and the devastating effects that entrepreneurship has on mental health. They're not going to talk about physical health, right? They're going to talk about SpaceX IPO being 1.75 trillion, and man, look at Elon make that happen. And look, kudos to him. He's done a great job. But I think society needs to be a little bit more realistic because, frankly, not everybody should be an entrepreneur. But let's get into those bumps, right? So, I'll give you a first one. So, when I quit my job, first I find out I have cardiovascular disease, but I still had in my mind that I wanted to create a mobile app because in 2016 everybody was building mobile apps to help business travelers exercise more better on the road. One of my go-to-market strategies, or actually the go-to-market strategy, was to partner with CrossFit, the organization, and to launch this out into CrossFit boxes all around the world. The problem with that is that CrossFit didn't want to partner with me, and so I had left a very high-paying job in investment banking, and 6 months later got a cease and desist letter from CrossFit saying, "Don't do this, or we will sue you." Wow. Okay. You walk away from a $500,000 a year job. And now I'm sitting in our apartment in Amsterdam because we moved from Singapore to Amsterdam with my now wife, but we were just boyfriend and girlfriend back then. And I thought to myself, okay, I got it wrong. Now what do I do? What's interesting about this when the heart condition actually started to feel worse. And so I sat out and really tried to answer the question, how do I not die? And how do I not die very soon? And so that led me to kind of poking around and starting a podcast similar to you. I started a podcast called Decoding Superhuman. You can still find it. I don't release any new episodes on it, but uh, back then, this is 2016, podcasts were just a new thing. So I could email somebody and I could get anybody to join the podcast. And so for me, it was a free way to get consults. And that was great. But, even then, right after that, I started a, a company that was focused on corporate health and improving how corporate health programs are administered. And my hypothesis there, or my sort of tagline, was I want to put human back in human resources because in investment banking, there was no organization or position in the bank that I hated more than human resources. There were people that talked a lot about work-life balance that didn't really know what it's like to work very hard. They tried to get you or forced you to go to these lunchtime, learn lunch and learns about work-life balance. And the fact is like work-life balance is a complete sham. Um, and so I started this company, and I can get into that whole statement that I just made in a little bit, but I started this company to start putting the human back in human resources. And wouldn't it be great if employers actually cared about their own health? And, or sorry, employers cared about the health of their employees. And so I ended up partnering with two women who were ex human resources people and there's nothing wrong with them. It's just how we worked together as a team was kind of funny to launch programs that were very focused on getting blood testing essentially into organizations. And we had some success with some of the large corporations in Sweden, Norway, and a couple in Amsterdam. But fundamentally, as a culture, the three of us didn't mash. There were two HR people who still wanted to be HR people.
Mm.
And, that's one of those moments where you kind of smack yourself in the face and say, duh, like this didn't seem to work. But that was another blip along the way. And like, I have plenty of blowups, like plenty of landmines that I've stepped in along the way that have kind of, at the time, almost made me go back to something like finance, but have ultimately led to the person that you see today. And now they're just great stories to tell over dinner, right?
So hey, you could go back to finance. You choose not to. I'm assuming at this point, it's not merely about dollars and cents because probably that other path is, a little more certain. And I've sensed in you the entrepreneurial spirit, right? I also heard in you, a taste of mortality at a young age. I mean, how old were you when you were
30.
diagnosed? Right? When I counsel guys, I usually can't counsel them before midlife because they haven't had that taste of death, right?
Yeah.
Or contemplating it. And so I can tell those are big drivers in your life.
It's interesting about being told exactly what's going to kill you at that young of an age. You start to realize how short life really is. And for a while, I used to keep a spreadsheet on my desktop because it was motivating of the days I had left to live. And so you can take actuarial data tables about people with heart disease, and you can kind of come up with a reasonable number of age as to when you might have a cardiac event, and from there back into how many days you have to live. And what was, in hindsight, funny about that moment is it was sort of the bifurcation point that led me to say, well, if I'm only going to be here for a certain number of days, why don't I work on something that's truly meaningful that can push the world in a different direction? That ultimately became the nonprofit that we talked about earlier, right? And so the hypothesis there is that if we can just do this with a certain number of practitioners, and there's something about 3.5% of a population, there's actually a theorem on this, that if you can get 3.5% of a population to convert to something in a non-violent movement, you're guaranteed to succeed.
Mm.
That's happened when the Philippines overthrew the first Marcos regime in, I think that was the 80s. But there's numerous examples of that, right? So you don't need that many people. But again, getting faced with your own mortality at such a young age is the reason why I went in that direction.
Mm. Yeah, most people don't look at in the spiritual world, the dark night of the soul as an opportunity or an invitation. But the guys that I meet that really approach it in the way you just described live such meaningful lives. I just did a podcast with a guy who's late stage dementia, and he's going to be taking his life because he doesn't want to slip away before he can. And he was talking about how dementia was his rebirth. He
Yeah.
has lived more fully on the other side of it. Not that, he wished it or we should wish these things upon anybody, but I think it's a very entrepreneurial spirit that goes into even the dark nights of the soul and looks for, right, the opportunity.
Yeah. It's that case is particularly special, but there's an exercise that a gentleman named Dan Sullivan, and he coaches entrepreneurs all around the world actually. He makes all of his entrepreneurs do. And the exercise goes a little like this. It's um, you have a number in your head of how long you're going to live, right? And that's an age. You write it down on a piece of paper. And then you take your life to the 2 weeks before that number comes on the piece of paper. And you ask yourself, what would you be doing in those 2 weeks prior to knowing that you're going to die? You write all this stuff down. It takes 5 minutes. It's like, who do you want to spend time with? What do you want to be working on? Where do you want to be in the world? All that stuff, right? And then you sit with it for a little bit, and he pops up this magical question of, why don't you do that now? And then the result of you doing that now, how does that change that number? Because if I knew I had 2 weeks to live, I would live my life in a certain way. And how does that change that number? And oftentimes when people do this exercise, they actually extend that number. And that number, I think he calls the exercise like living to 158 or something like that, right? And just by doing that, it can have such a profound effect on people that they start living their life in a very different manner today.
Such an important reminder. My previous incarnation, I was a rabbi and I used to do funerals.
Mhm.
And I did so many funerals for guys who retired, and you could just kind of watch the hockey stick decline. And they worked their whole life at jobs that maybe they liked, maybe they hated, but get to that point of retire. Now I can do the thing I love. And what a waste, what a tragedy.
I Here, I'll open the kimono here a little bit. One of the reasons why I tell people I will never retire is because of my father. My father is exactly the person that you described. Worked his way, started from nothing, like to the point where, he in college, which he put himself through by working 40 to 60 hours a week, he spent money on beer instead of milk and put beer in his Wheaties, right? This is a guy who came from nothing, worked his way up the corporate ladder, eventually became senior vice president of operations at a mutual fund. Um, Incredible worker, incredibly disciplined, and ended up working himself into a situation where, as an operations person, he was outsourcing different divisions and then eventually outsourced himself, got himself an early retirement before the age of 55. His entire life, his one hobby was to do competition barbecue. In fact, like I have as part of my resume, if you ever find it, is I was the youngest barbecue champion of the state of New Jersey and actually through the whole Kansas City Barbecue Society at the age of 16. But he was the reason why I was doing barbecue when I was younger. So he retires. Parents moved down to Asheville from Philadelphia. Beautiful place. His whole intention is to do competition barbecue. Just doesn't do it, right? And his other hobby, his less healthy hobby, actually both are unhealthy, but his less healthy hobby is drinking wine. Guess what took over, right? And so retirement to me seems like the fast track to something like that, whereby my dad is an alcoholic. If I talk to him when he's sober, we can have great conversations. If I talk to him when he's drunk, it's a little bit of a different story. And he's already seeing signs of early onset dementia, right? And this is a guy with a family history of Alzheimer's. And so, one of the things that absolutely terrifies me about retirement is that idea of the cliff, right? And so, if you don't have something to do, that cliff accelerates very fast.
Yeah, it's so true. It's a double-edged sword too, because on the one hand, that's, an extreme that lots of guys go through. And on the other hand, just constantly working. I have this book, and it's based on 6 questions, and they're simple questions. But if you ask a guy, the second question a guy always gets asked. First question is, "Hey, I'm Boomer. What's your name?" The second question is,
What do you
"What
do?
do you do?"
Yeah.
And the answer is always, "I make money by, whatever, fill in the blank." And it's an interesting thing because I didn't ask you how you make money.
Yeah. And it's funny is that the simplest questions are often the hardest to answer, right?
Yeah.
And so, when people ask me, because I also like to take those questions in different ways because it leads to a different conversation and usually a more memorable conversation. It's like, what do you do? And I say, I explore my curiosity, right? And the theme throughout everything that I've done in my life has been an interest in human behavior. If you think about finance, that's human behavior reflected on a macro scale. If you look at health and really dive into biochemistry and neurotransmitters and those things, that's what generates human behavior, right? There's somewhat of an illusion that we're in control of our own lives sometimes. And many times, what I mean by that is that we have biochemistry that's running in the background that we might not necessarily have the full control over, that is oftentimes dictating our decisions.
Yeah, and the work is as a man, can you answer like you did, what do you do in dynamic ways so that you get to retirement? There's no such thing, in the ancient world, there's no name, there's no word for retirement. Like it's a modern concept. So I'm going to work and then I'm going to not work versus, what do I do? Well, you answered it. You're never going to stop exploring your curiosity, I imagine, knowing you already.
Yeah, I mean, even if I were to stop employment, right, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to go travel to different geographies to explore different ecosystems. And when I exhaust that curiosity, I'm sure something else will come up along the way. But my wife likes to say that, she made this comment the other night where she's like, I need to have a hobby and I need to do something on the side. And I was like, yeah, I do too. And she's like, what are you kidding me? Like your entire life is hobbies, right? Like it's just one continuous hobby, and one continuous exploration of hobbies. So yeah, I don't think I'll ever not be curious. And if I was not curious, I don't think I'd be living, to be fair. And I don't mean that in like a suicidal sense. I just think the curiosity would only terminate if I were to pass.
Well, there's a lot of ways to kill yourself, and some of which leave you above ground, breathing, walking, and talking, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And a guy who's committed to exploring his curiosity ain't going to be that guy. So
Yeah.
I'm getting to learn about Boomer, some of the pieces. I never think of the why as like the thing. I think of it as all the kind of ingredients to bake the pie that is Boomer. So, I really have heard, the brush with mortality, the commitment to disrupting health, quote unquote, healthcare. I've heard the driver of having a role model in front of you, and role model isn't always positive either, right? There's all kinds
Yeah.
of ways to have life modeled to us, some of which, like my father killed himself, so we have a negative role models sometimes. Um, I've heard of quite a few things. What else is in that the driver of Boomer's why?
What's interesting is this gets more into our company's why, but they're, as you alluded to before the podcast, they kind of seamlessly flow across. So there, at one point, I was fortunate enough to live a life where I was very successful very early. I had one of these hockey stick type careers in finance.
Are we talking about your barbecue success?
Well, that too.
Oh,
So I guess there's sort of a theme there, right? Like barbecue, finance, whatever. I was usually pretty quick to learn something and then get to a level of mastery of it. And within finance, I told you earlier about how I looked around and saw everybody that was doing my job at the other banks. They were 30 years older than me, and so I decided to leave, right? And so along the way, I began asking the question, like, why am I not happy? Right? Because I see all of this stuff. This was just when social media was starting, all this stuff on social media, or all of these other people that seem so happy that they come around with a smile on their face every single day. But like, why is my inner dialogue so fucking awful? Like, it's just horrific sometimes. So when you start unpeeling the layers of the onion there, and you buy enough biohacking devices to realize that not all of them do something, but none of them are the panacea that you're looking for, I started delving into spirituality, and specifically because I was living in Singapore at the time, more of an Asian bent to that, right? And so I started getting into learning about things like meditation and meditation practices, and eventually stumbled across an ancient Tibetan practice, which actually gets wrongly attributed to Buddhism, but originally came from spiritual practice in a region of Tibet called Zhangzhun, called Bon, right? And Bon existed, pre-Buddhist Bon existed, as the name says, pre-Buddhism. And Dzogchen is just the ability to sit openly with your thoughts, no matter what they are, and not get attached to them. So when it comes to the company's why, what we tell people is that we want to democratize enlightenment. Enlightenment is a very loaded word for most people. Somebody listening to this is probably like, oh, wow, this guy is talking about monks sitting on a hilltop in the Himalayas, wearing robes, occasionally ringing bells, asking for alms, all that stuff, right? Um, but enlightenment, if you boil it down to, separating your or the attachment from your ego, what are you really getting into? We're getting into the idea of being present and tangentially a feeling of equanimity, right? So equanimity is just the ability to sit with those thoughts, not be attached to them. And so I like to draw like a waves in the ocean, right? And so you can have some high waves sometimes, and there you're feeling really good. You have some low waves. Well, being equanimous is essentially sitting in a still pond, and everything's just sort of passing through. And so when we talk about democratizing enlightenment, we're actually democratizing presence. And what we've identified to focus on, and also because I work with two physicians, is that one of the factors that gets in the way of presence is health, right? If you think about it, if you're in pain, you're probably attached to like, you're sitting there thinking about your pain all the time, right? You're not saying to yourself, well, that's just a warm sensation that somewhat is prickly in my toe. Um, if you are sick, if you can't focus, all of those things lead to a life where you're not present. And this is coming from a guy from those ages of 26 to 30 when I was living in Singapore as an investment banker. I traveled to 40 countries in 4 years, have eaten in more Michelin star restaurants than I can count, have stayed at five-star hotels. I can tell you in every one of those dinners, I was underneath the table with my BlackBerry at the time because that's what people used. I was typing out emails and I was not being present with this gorgeous meal that some chef took decades of training to learn how to make. I was just eating it, leaving, etc., and being able to tell people, "Hey, I went to that restaurant." Um, so getting back to me here, like that exploration, that vector of spirituality, it's always been there in the background. I've always been curious. Like spirituality to me is, the study or the belief in something greater than yourself. Um, I've always been curious about that, but that vector didn't really arise until you have enough material success and enough experimentation with other modalities to really come to the idea of, okay, maybe I just need to learn how to sit with these thoughts and be present with them.
So, there's two ways to get to sort of that spiritual awakening that you describe. In my experience, having gone through it and going through it, guiding people through it, is I call mountaintops and valleys. And the mountaintops is beautiful, sunset, baby's born. By the way, you have a baby about to be born, is that right?
Yeah, wow. You really did. Yeah. Yeah, you did research actually in exactly a month from today.
So you'll see, right? Mountaintop moment needs no effort to kind of see the face of God. It's the valleys oftentimes that, really rip it out wide open, shatter us. You described though getting there in Tibet or wherever you were through a mountaintop, or did I miss some of the valleys along the way?
Yeah, so the valleys they were kind of how I lived life up until the age of probably 35, right? In the sense of, now I describe anxiety as like Santa's little helper in the sense that it's been there alongside me. And some people have anxiety that's paralyzing, but mine's been one that's just sort of pushed me along the way. And it's allowed me to have a lot of success. Um, but I was absolutely miserable inside my head because anxiety, by definition, is thinking about the future. I was not able to sit present. Like, if you would have met me, let's say 5 years ago, I would not be able to sit present with this conversation. I may look like I was sitting present with the conversation, but I would be thinking about the next thing or what's the next goal. And yeah, in some ways, society rewards that type of behavior, right? You set a goal, you achieve a goal, you set a goal, you achieve a goal. But I was always in the midst of achieving the goal and then setting the next one and not celebrating the one that I just achieved, right? So you ended up with this sort of state when I was 30 that I was like, well, why am I doing this? And what else is out there? And so that was a definite valley, is like you're questioning, like, what the hell are we doing here? Right. And, then I go and start a business. And usually when you launch a business the first time, it doesn't always go well. It's really messy. And every day, Dan Sullivan, going back to who I mentioned earlier, calls it the gap in the gain, right? And so every day, I go into this area called the gap, which is essentially what you just described as valleys, right? And when you're not aware of your thoughts or don't have any discipline around meditation um, or any sort of practice to support here, you can become attached to that feeling. And that would leave me in that valley for quite a long time. The exposure to not necessarily the peak, but the exposure to um, that kind of freedom that can exist when you're able to sit with your thoughts and not get attached to them, that actually came through psychedelics. And so I was introduced to psychedelics. I knew about them, avoided them like the plague, because when I was 19, I had a friend kill himself after having a bad mushroom trip. And I just told everybody, like, I just wrote them off as just not a positive experience for humans. And keep in mind, though, I was drinking a lot of alcohol at this time. And I just, which is very interesting because David Nutt is a British researcher, published a study around harm to self and harm to others among substances. And, alcohol is number one or number two on that list, whereas some of these psychedelic substances are more like 15 to 20 on that list in terms of rank. But I got introduced to psychedelics, and, it was really the first time where I had this kind of break from my incessant rumination. And that allowed me to know, that was like the direct introduction to what was possible. And then, through both microdosing and large dosing, but also the practices in between, because the integrations where all the magic is. It's not necessarily the experience itself will show you what's possible, but the integration is really what's important for bringing it back to your everyday life. Over time, the person that I was when I was 35 versus now is almost 180 degrees different.
I'm a big fan of psychedelics used, in the right context for the right reasons, but I've
Absolutely.
seen it just accelerate my own growth, spiritual. It's one thing to have faith, it's another thing to know something,
Yeah.
right? And I just describe it more as a knowing. What have been your like what psychedelics are we talking about?
Well, let's see. I could break them down into classes first, and then we can kind of go down into individual ones. So keep in mind, by the way, at this point when I was introduced to them, I was living in Amsterdam. And 5 years ago, you could order most psychedelics, and we're talking phenethylamines, tryptamines, but they're broadly classified as research chemicals. Online, I get them delivered to my door, and they come from a lab. We're not talking things like cocaine. Like, I never touched cocaine, but we're talking um, anything. So if we go down the phenethylamine route, my first introduction to this was MDMA. I had one experience in a previous life at a Steve Aoki concert where I wouldn't say it was most enlightening thing, but I was like, wow, this feels great. But my first introduction to psychedelics, and specifically psychedelic assisted therapy, was through the use of MDMA with a sitter, and that was a therapist. And you talk about things that I carried with me my entire life that I felt guilty about, or um, shameful of, or fearful of. And within 1 4 to 6 hour MDMA session, they're gone, right? It was that fear inoculation with MDMA was so powerful that I was able to bring up these stories that I had in my past of doing things that I was kind of embarrassed about at the time, and talking about them, and then kind of realizing that, hey, it was just something that I did and I shouldn't feel guilty about this. Nobody was harmed, whatever. Um, that was the introduction. And I think it was a very safe introduction. And usually when I refer people to psychedelic assisted therapy, if they haven't done it before, MDMA is, each person is different, but it's kind of like usually a good introduction for people. Psilocybin, I think psilocybin was an interesting foray into tryptamines. However, I would say some of the research chemicals that were available in Amsterdam were more interesting to me in the sense that psilocybin can become very emotional. But if I wanted to objectively look at something and learn from it without the and strip the emotion away, some people like the emotional feeling, that's fine. But there's a molecule called 4-hydroxymethyltryptamine, which is Sasha Shulgin put it in his book Tikal, Tryptamines I've Known and Loved. That has been profound. I've also had experiences with ayahuasca, some more amphetamine like molecules that are like 3-MMC, 4-MMC, and a few others. Actually, there's probably a large list of others that I could go to.
Wow. Do you foresee these continuously evolving and make it into the healthcare industry, sort of mainstreamed?
I think they are now, and if I have my way, we talked about challenging the process earlier. If I have my way, I'd love to have. One of the things that I'm actively working on right now is trying to decriminalize some of these substances within the city of Chicago where I live. And that's a very, very hard task. It's the third largest city in the United States. But I think even at a federal level, I was hopeful a couple of years ago that MDMA would be passed as a therapy because it has been so immensely helpful for me and for people with PTSD. And I do some work with veterans. That substance can be amazingly helpful. Right now, you do see a lot more ketamine clinics popping up. My concern here is that I'm very pro psychedelics for the right person. So, what I mean by that is that there has to be somewhat of an intake. Is this person fit for this? Because some of these substances can induce schizophrenia, or other mental health conditions. So, is this person fit for this? And based on that sort of also medical assessment, pairing them with a therapist, somebody who can take them on that journey, um, that is really the multiplier effect to me. So when we talk about psychedelic use, you can take it on your own, yeah, and you might get some realizations and they might be profoundly helpful for you, and great, that's awesome. I love that. But what I've found is that the multiplier effect really comes in working with a great therapist. But just going back to your question about the healthcare system, we now see emerging research or funding going to research for things like ibogaine, which has a very dirty mechanism of action that we're not entirely sure what it does, but has profound effects on addiction, or it seems to have profound case reports of effects on addiction. Um, Research in Switzerland on lysergic acid diethylamide, which is LSD, on anxiety, psilocybin on end of life uh, therapy. And, a lot of these molecules are also being used for depression. So ketamine and treatment resistant depression. And I'm super excited about that. In fact, uh, actually very excited that people can have those opportunities to have those substances available to them in a very controlled, healthy setting. Because the flip side to all of this is like in the United States, you have to worry about fentanyl being in stuff. And so sourcing becomes an issue if you go out to the street. And, if we can find a way to get it to people who need it, meaning that we're not charging them a fortune, um, but at the same time, giving them that experience that is safe, that's the ultimate end goal for me.
It is pretty crazy that since it's federally Schedule One, there can't be FDA research to make it safe. So then we send people out into the black market so that they can roll the dice in a world filled with fentanyl. Like you can't make up the absurdity of that. And yes, I think it's changing too, but maybe not as fast as we would like. But I do think it's here to stay. I mean, it's been here to stay for thousands of years.
Yeah, it has a very long history with us, right? So cannabis has been a part of the Chinese culture for 5,000 years, right? And there's documented evidence of that. Um, Ibogaine, which I mentioned, comes from a shrub in Gabon, and it's been a part of their culture for a long time. A lot of these substances have been rites of passage. We have um, various substances that have been used in ancient Greece, for example, and people have tried to copy those or try to recreate those. The kykeon is the one I'm referring to. But there's a number of these substances that I think deserve a place in culture, and ultimately, for me, if we can create a more collaborative atmosphere, I think you can solve a lot of the world's problems much faster. And these substances open that opportunity.
Aho. All right, let's go. So, as we start to wrap up, any sort of, I don't know, final thoughts? I feel like this one has sort of entrepreneurs written all over it. You've been on the path, you've seen the ups and the downs. Anything else you would offer to somebody out there listening about Boomer Anderson's why?
Well, before I get into that, I would just say one of the things that we touched on quite a bit in this conversation is call yourself an entrepreneur, an operator, business builder, whatever you want to call yourself. That journey is very difficult. And oftentimes it could feel a lot like you have a lot of unique problems and they're all yours and it's your cross to bear, so to speak. And it's your struggle. That can become overwhelming and can and often does result in diagnosable mental health conditions. To those people, I would encourage you to just reach out to somebody. Like, reach out to somebody who's an entrepreneur. There's many different entrepreneurial communities in every city in the United States or around the world. Try and find a community of people that will help you recognize that they're going through a lot of the same problems too. And maybe it's mutual suffering, or I happen to think it's just a little bit better. The idea of mastermind has taken off in many recent years, right? That came from Think and Go Rich, Napoleon Hill. But, mastermind could just be a community of people that you get together and you share stories with and you learn from. So to those people listening, go out and find your community and don't be afraid to speak up. Do reach out to somebody. Don't keep it on your own shoulders. Now, going back to my own why, look, I think this has been a pretty wide-ranging conversation about a number of different things. And in fact, the next time I'm in Boulder, I hope we can really go down the wormhole on a couple more together in person. But it's, to me, part of the fun of life is challenging existing institutions, processes, theories, and seeing if there's a different way. And so, to everybody who's on that path, keep finding that different way.
I love it. Yeah, there's only a handful of common denominators I can find in men who kill themselves, one of which is loneliness. And I think you just named it well, and I also think you prescribed, a remedy to it. We started an organization, nonprofit called Men's Peer Groups, bringing together men in person in the Denver Boulder area, but also now virtually online. And I've seen, I've been a therapist and men's coach for a long time, and I've seen that there's no substitute for a community of support, not just a one-on-one. I mean, one-on-one is fine. It's great. It has its place. But as you named it, there's nothing more powerful than knowing you're not alone.
Amazing. Well, B,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for the conversation.
Boomer, it was a pleasure to get to know you. I look forward to seeing you in person in Boulder and follow up podcasts. So appreciate you, brother. Thank you.
Awesome. Take care, B.